The following is a slightly adapted version of Brendan Cooney's text on abstract labor. The link to the text is in the description. In Grundrisse, Marx says the simplest abstraction, then, which modern economics places at the head of its discussions, and which expresses an immeasurably ancient relation, valid in all forms of society, nevertheless achieves practical truth as an abstraction, only as a category of the most modern society. Of course, for all of human history, labor has been a certain productive expenditure of muscles, nerves, brains, etc. However, human labor has not always produced value, nor have all societies considered all human labor to be qualitatively the same in an economic sense. While the labor of a feudal serf and a guildsman may have both been productive expenditures of muscles, nerves, brains, etc., these societies did not have a notion of man in general, or of the qualitative equality between labors. An hour of serf's labor was not qualitatively equal to an hour of guild labor. While it may have been possible to form a mental abstraction of human labor in general in past societies, it is only in capitalism that such an abstraction becomes a practical truth. And this is why the notion of labor in general as the source of economic value only emerges with the development of capitalism. When Marx says that abstract labor attains a practical truth in capitalism, he means that labor is treated abstractly in actual social practice. Capitalists and workers, as personifications of the economic categories of capital and labor, treat labor abstractly. They do this not because of an idea they have of abstract labor, but because such social practice is an essential part of capitalist production. There are several overlapping ways that labor is treated abstractly in capitalist production. While socially necessary labor time assures that an hour of work is a uniform expenditure of abstract energy, this occurs within a complex of interlocking social relations, which allow for such a practical abstraction. To start with, the fact that workers are separated from the means of production through the institution of private property means that an individual has no permanent relation to a particular type of labor. Workers in a capitalist society do not own the means of production, but instead sell their labor to a capitalist who owns the means of production. Rather than workers being in control of the objects upon which they labor, workers are denuded, empty subjects with no objective connection to any specific labor process. They could be hired by any capitalist to perform any type of concrete labor. Divorced also from their means of subsistence, workers seek a job not to fulfill themselves as productive, creative beings, but in order to make money to buy their subsistence in the market. The specific concrete labor they do has no particular bearing on the goal of earning money to buy subsistence goods. All jobs make money, and so any job is as good as another. From this perspective, as long as it allows one to purchase the same subsistence goods as any other job, the result is a society in which workers are relatively indifferent to the type of labor they perform. People pass with relative ease from one occupation to the next, and society educates the entire workforce in a general set of skills that prepares workers to do a variety of interchangeable jobs. The capitalist mode of production only arises historically when capital confronts the totality of all labors potentially, and the particular one it confronts at any time is an accidental matter. The skeptical viewer may object that, subjectively, workers have a range of attitudes about their work, not all of which reflect an utter indifference to their occupation. It is unlikely that when Marx speaks of abstract labor being characterized by an indifference to concrete labor, he is making a claim to describe all subjective feelings about work. Rather, he is describing certain objective conditions which cause the particular concrete types of work to be a matter of relative indifference to both capitalists and laborers. Subjective attitudes exist within what might be termed an objective indifference to the particular concrete form of labor. Compared to the rigid class systems of pre-capitalist societies, capitalist society shows a high degree of mobility between concrete labors. People in feudal Europe did not have jobs. They were born into a class and performed the labor associated with the class until they died. The relative mobility between occupations in a capitalist society is a reflection of the fact that workers are not tied to any particular means of production and are thus treated as abstract units which can be applied to any production process. More importantly, separated from the means of production, workers do not own the product of their own work, nor do they control the labor process. As denuded subjects, all they can do is perform labor at a pace and content dictated to them by the objective organization of production that they confront. This makes it impossible for workers to have an experience of work in which their labor is a true process of fulfilling their creative potential as social beings. Instead, work is a task, an imposition, a job, a drag, something to get through in order to survive. Though workers work with means of production, these means of production are the property of someone else, a capitalist whose material interest is to control the labor process for the purpose of maximizing exploitation. The means of production confront the worker as an alien being, and thus concrete labor appears to the worker as an alien in process imposed upon her. With no intrinsic relation to a concrete labor process, the worker enters production as an abstract subject. The imperative to produce at the socially necessary labor time enforces a tendency towards uniformity and production norms. An assembly line worker at Ford might easily replace an assembly line worker at Chrysler, because the pressure to produce at the average level of efficiency creates a tendency for the spread of technological and labor practices across an industry, so that work is virtually identical from one job to another. The particular worker is highly expendable, easily replaced by another. This is true between industries as well, as the cog-like activity of labor becomes increasingly similar from one type of work to another. Socially necessary labor time dictates that an hour of concrete labor performed at the socially necessary labor time is an hour of abstract labor. If the socially necessary labor time to make a widget is 1 hour, and it takes me an hour to make a widget, then I've performed an hour of abstract labor. If it takes 2 concrete hours to make the widget, then I still have produced an hour of abstract labor. This mechanism imposes a uniform efficiency on all labor, so that all labor is valued equally as an abstract expenditure of human energy. By valuing commodities in this way, capitalism erases the difference between workers, so that any one worker's labor is just an anonymous input in a giant mass of social labor, the individual pieces of which are indistinguishable from one another. The imperative to produce at or under the socially necessary labor time is the prime motivator in the mechanization of work and the scientific management of the labor process. Value is measured in hours, and thus the vast majority of changes to the production process revolve around the need to decrease the time it takes to carry out tasks. The less control the worker has over the labor process, the easier it is for the capitalist to increase the speed and intensity of work. Machines and scientific management of the labor process are the prime weapons of capital in its quest to take control of the labor process away from workers. Machines free capital from its dependence on the concrete skill of workers. By dictating the pace and intensity of work through a machine, the worker becomes a cog in the machine, an abstract input into the production process, with no space for the exertion of will or creativity. Lastly, it should be noted that capitalist production has one goal, and this is to extract the maximum amount of surplus value from workers. The capitalist only concern is to invest money in order to make more money. In order to increase the surplus value, capital must pass the stage of concrete labor. Commodities with use values must be produced. But the specific type of commodity and the specific labor process required to produce this commodity are a matter of indifference for capital. It is the accumulation of value for its own sake, abstracting away from the use value in concrete labor. That is the reason for capitalist production. To the capitalist, all labor is the same as long as it produces surplus labor time. This absolute indifference to concrete labor contributes to the degradation and domination of the labor process.